The Iraqi desert was burning. Forward operating base Hawk's Nest was under heavy artillery fire. 2 Apaches lay destroyed. 1 remained intact in the hangar. The lieutenant colonel's voice crackled through the speakers. "Any Apache pilot on base? We need air cover now." Silence. Every qualified pilot was either airborne or wounded. Explosions thundered closer. The enemy was breaching the perimeter. In the maintenance bay, a woman in grease-stained coveralls looked up from wiping oil off her hands. She spoke quietly but firmly. "I can fly it." The room fell silent. Then someone whispered, "She's just a mechanic." Her name was Sergeant Amelia Torres. Everyone on base called her Mia. She was 31 years old, 5'4", with calloused hands that always smelled like hydraulic fluid and gun oil. She'd been maintaining Apache helicopters for 4 years, and before that, she'd spent 3 years working on Blackhawks in Germany. Her job was to keep the birds flying, not to fly them herself. That was the rule. That was how it had always been. But Mia had grown up around helicopters. Her father, Captain Daniel Torres, had been an Air Force pilot. She remembered sitting on his lap when she was 6 years old, watching him move the cyclic stick in a flight simulator. He would let her touch the controls and tell her stories about flying above the clouds where nothing could hurt you. He told her the sky was the only place where you could be truly free. She believed him. She wanted that freedom more than anything. When she was 12, her father died in a training accident. Engine failure at low altitude, no time to recover. The funeral was full of dress uniforms and folded flags and people saying he died doing what he loved. Mia did not cry that day. She made herself a promise instead. She promised she would fly, just like he did. She would live in the sky where he had died. At 18, she enlisted in the Air Force and applied for flight school. She passed every test, every physical, every psychological evaluation. Then came the vision screening. Her left eye was 0.75 diopters below the required standard, just 1/4 of 1 diopter. The examiner shook his head and stamped her file with a red "disqualified." She appealed twice, both times denied. The rules were the rules, so she became a mechanic instead. If she could not fly the machines, she would understand them better than anyone else. She learned every system, every sensor, every bolt and wire in an Apache AH-64. She could disassemble a turbine engine blindfolded. She knew the vibration frequency of a failing tail rotor bearing just by listening. The pilots would joke and call her Grease Girl, and she would smile and say nothing. They did not know that after every night shift, she would walk to the old storage building behind the maintenance hangar, where someone had left a broken flight simulator from the 90s. She would sit in that dusty cockpit for hours, running scenarios, practicing emergency procedures, learning to fly a machine she would never be allowed to touch. In her locker, she kept a green canvas bag. Inside that bag was her father's silver pilot badge. It was tarnished and worn, and the engraving had faded, but you could still read the words if you held it up to the light. "Captain D. Torres, fly safe." She carried it with her every single day. Some nights, when the base was quiet and she was alone in the hangar, she would take it out and hold it in her palm and whisper to it like a prayer. "He died in the sky. I will live there one day." Nobody knew about the simulator. Nobody knew about the bag. Nobody knew that Sergeant Amelia Torres, the quiet mechanic who fixed their helicopters, had more flight hours in her head than some of the rookie pilots had in real life. And nobody would have believed her if she told them until the day she had to prove it. The attack came at dawn. Mia had been awake for 22 hours straight, finishing a turbine replacement on Apache tail number 734. Her hands were black with grease, her flight suit soaked through with sweat. The desert heat was already climbing past 100 degrees, even though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. She was tightening the last bolt on the engine cowling when the first mortar round hit the east perimeter wall. The explosion shook the entire hangar. Tools clattered off the workbenches. Someone screamed. Mia dropped her wrench and ran toward the hangar door just as the second and third rounds came in, walking across the flight line in a pattern that told her this was not random harassment fire. This was a coordinated attack. This was serious. Outside, black smoke poured from the fuel depot. Two Apaches sat on the tarmac, rotors drooping, cockpit glass shattered. One had taken a direct hit to the ammunition bay. The other had caught fire and was burning so hot that nobody could get near it. Pilots and crew chiefs were sprinting in every direction, some toward the bunkers, some toward the armory. The base alarm was wailing. Radio chatter was chaos. Someone was shouting about enemy trucks 3 kilometers out and closing fast. Mia ran back into the hangar. The only Apache left was the one she had just finished working on. Tail number 734. She had replaced its turbine, calibrated its targeting system, and test-fired its 30-millimeter chain gun just yesterday. It was fully armed, fully fueled, and ready to fly, but there was nobody to fly it. The lieutenant colonel burst through the side door, his uniform dusty and his face streaked with ash. He was holding a radio in one hand and a sidearm in the other. He looked at the Apache, then looked around the hangar at the mechanics and technicians who had frozen in place, staring at him. His voice was hoarse when he shouted into the radio. "Command, this is Hawk's Nest Actual. We have troops pinned down 2 miles north of our position. I need immediate air support. Do we have any Apache pilots on base? Anyone?" The radio crackled. A voice came back thin and distant. "Negative, Hawk's Nest. All flight crews are either airborne or in the medical tent. You have no available pilots." The lieutenant colonel swore. He looked at the Apache again, then at the mechanics. "Anyone here have flight experience? Anyone at all?" Silence. The mechanics looked at each other. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mia felt her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear her father's voice in her head. The sky is the only place where you can be truly free. She thought about the simulator. She thought about the 4 years she had spent learning every system in this machine. She thought about the 43 soldiers who were pinned down 2 miles north, waiting for help that was not going to come. She stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. "I can fly it." Everyone turned to stare at her. The lieutenant colonel frowned. "Sergeant Torres, your maintenance crew. You're not flight certified." "No, sir, I'm not certified," Mia said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "But I've been working on Apaches for 4 years. I know this bird better than anyone on this base. I've run diagnostics on every system. I've tested every weapon. I know how she handles, how she sounds, how she feels. And I've been training on simulators since I was 18. One of the other mechanics, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, shook his head. "Mia, a simulator is not the same as the real thing. You've never actually flown." "I know," Mia said. She looked at the lieutenant colonel. "But right now I'm all you've got." The lieutenant colonel stared at her for a long moment. Outside, another mortar round hit somewhere close. The building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. He looked at the Apache, then back at Mia. His jaw tightened. "If you crash that bird, Sergeant, you'll be court-martialed." "If I don't take it up, sir, those soldiers are going to die." He closed his eyes. She could see him doing the math in his head, weighing the risk of sending an uncertified pilot against the certainty of losing an entire platoon. When he opened his eyes again, his face was hard. "Get it airborne, Sergeant. That's an order." Mia did not wait for him to change his mind. She grabbed her helmet off the workbench and sprinted toward the Apache. Her hands were still greasy. Her flight suit was still soaked with sweat. She climbed up onto the stub wing, pulled open the cockpit door, and dropped into the pilot's seat. The controls felt exactly like the simulator. The cyclic stick, the collective, the pedals. She had touched these 1,000 times during maintenance, but never like this. Never with the intention of flying. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. It was creased and faded, the edges worn soft from years of handling. The image showed a young man in a flight suit standing next to a Huey helicopter, his hand resting on the nose. Captain Daniel Torres, her father. In the bottom corner, written in pencil in her own handwriting from years ago, were 5 words. "For Dad, who flew so I could dream." She taped the photograph to the instrument panel, right above the altimeter where she would see it the entire flight. Her hands moved across the switches and buttons, flipping them in the sequence she had memorized years ago. The auxiliary power unit whined to life. The turbines began to spool up. The rotor blades started to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until they were a blur above her head. The lieutenant colonel's voice crackled in her headset. "Mechanic or not, you're our only air support. Call sign Grease 1. Mia looked at her father's photograph one more time. Then her hands tightened on the controls. She took a deep breath. "Copy that. Grease 1, lifting off." The Apache lifted off the ground, and Mia felt her stomach drop. This was nothing like the simulator. The whole aircraft vibrated with raw power. The cyclic stick was more sensitive than she expected. The pedals required more force. The noise was overwhelming, a deep, throbbing roar that she felt in her chest. For a split second, panic flickered through her mind. What if she could not do this? What if she crashed? What if everyone on base was watching her fail? Then she looked at her father's photograph taped to the instrument panel, and the panic disappeared. She had spent 4 years preparing for this moment. She knew this machine. She pulled the collective up smoothly, added right pedal to counter the torque, and pushed the cyclic forward. The Apache climbed into the burning sky. Behind her on the ground, every person in the hangar had stopped what they were doing and stepped outside to watch. They stood in silence as the mechanic who fixed their helicopters flew one for the first time. The lieutenant colonel stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Staff Sergeant Kowalski shook his head slowly and muttered something under his breath. Nobody knew if this was courage or insanity. Mia leveled off at 500 feet and banked northeast toward the coordinates the lieutenant colonel had given her. The desert stretched out below, flat and brown and empty, except for the black smoke rising from the base behind her. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were slick with sweat inside her gloves. The targeting system was active. The weapons were hot. She was flying a $50 million attack helicopter with 0 official flight hours, heading straight into a combat zone. The radio crackled. "Grease 1, this is Hawk's Nest Actual. Enemy convoy spotted 2 miles north, bearing 045. Multiple vehicles, heavy weapons. Our ground troops are taking fire and cannot move. You are cleared to engage." Mia's hands tightened on the controls. "Copy, Hawk's Nest. I have visual on enemy position." She could see them now. 5 vehicles moving in a line across the desert, kicking up dust. 2 technical trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds. 3 larger vehicles that looked like they were carrying mortars or rockets. She activated the targeting system, and the helmet-mounted display lit up with green crosshairs. She had tested this system 100 times on the ground. She had never fired it from the air. She selected the Hydra 70 rockets and locked onto the lead vehicle. Her finger hovered over the trigger. This was it. This was real. If she missed, the enemy would know she was here and they would shoot back. If she hit, she would have just killed people. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "The sky is the only place where you can be truly free." She squeezed the trigger. The rocket streaked out in a white trail of smoke and fire. 2 seconds later, the lead vehicle exploded in a ball of orange flame. The second vehicle swerved and stopped. Mia banked hard left, came around for another pass, and fired again. Another hit. The convoy was breaking apart, vehicles scattering in different directions. The radio exploded with voices. "Grease 1, that's a direct hit. You just took out their lead gun truck." The lieutenant colonel's voice cut through. "Outstanding, Grease 1. Keep hitting them. Buy our people time to move." Mia felt a surge of adrenaline. She pulled the Apache into a tight turn and lined up on the third vehicle. But before she could fire, a warning alarm screamed in her headset. Missile lock. Someone on the ground had a surface-to-air missile and they had just locked onto her. She reacted on instinct. She punched the countermeasure button and threw the Apache into a hard dive to the right. Flares shot out behind her, white-hot decoys spiraling through the air. The missile tracked one of the flares and detonated 50 meters behind her. The shockwave rocked the helicopter. Alarms were screaming. The aircraft shuddered. Then she felt it. A grinding vibration from the tail rotor. Something was wrong. She checked the instruments. Tail rotor RPM was fluctuating. The missile had not hit her directly, but shrapnel must have damaged something. The helicopter was still flying, but it was sluggish. The controls felt heavy. The radio crackled again. "Grease 1, you're trailing smoke. What's your status?" Mia gritted her teeth. She had spent 4 years fixing helicopters. She knew exactly what was wrong. The tail rotor driveshaft bearing was failing. She had maybe 10 minutes before it seized completely and she lost all directional control. She could turn back to base right now and maybe land safely, or she could finish the mission. She looked at the instrument panel, at her father's photograph, at the words she had written in pencil when she was 18 years old. "For Dad, who flew so I could dream." She keyed the radio. "Hawk's Nest, this is Grease 1. I've got damage to the tail rotor, but I'm still airborne. I can finish this." "Negative, Grease 1. Return to base immediately. That's an order." Mia ignored the order. She pulled the Apache around and locked onto the remaining vehicles. She could hear the grinding sound getting louder. The vibration was getting worse. But she was not going to leave those soldiers on the ground. Not when she could still fight. She fired the last of her rockets. 2 more vehicles exploded. The enemy convoy was destroyed. She activated the 30mm chain gun and strafed the area, suppressing any remaining resistance. Tracers arced up toward her from the ground, but she was already moving, jinking left and right, making herself a hard target. The radio came alive with cheering. "Grease 1, the enemy is breaking contact. Our guys are moving to safety. You did it!" Mia allowed herself one small breath of relief. Then she turned the crippled Apache back toward base. The tail rotor was screaming now. The controls were barely responding. She was flying on pure skill and willpower, nursing the helicopter through the sky 1 degree at a time. When the base came into view, she could see the entire unit standing outside, watching her approach. She came in low and slow, fighting the controls every second. The landing skids touched down hard. The helicopter bounced once, then settled. She cut the engines and the rotors began to spin down. For a moment, she just sat there in the cockpit, breathing hard, her hands shaking. Then she reached up and carefully peeled her father's photograph off the instrument panel. She folded it and put it back in her pocket. She climbed out of the cockpit and dropped to the ground. Her legs almost gave out. She pulled off her helmet. Her face was covered in dust and sweat and smoke. The lieutenant colonel walked toward her. His expression was stern. "Sergeant Torres, you disobeyed a direct order to return to base." Mia stood at attention. She did not apologize. The lieutenant colonel's face softened. He raised his hand in a salute. "And you saved 43 lives." The entire base erupted in applause. Soldiers were shouting, cheering, chanting her call sign. "Grease 1! Grease 1! Grease 1!" Mia just stood there, too exhausted to smile. She touched the pocket where her father's photograph was. She whispered so quietly that nobody else could hear. "We flew, Dad. We finally flew." If you believe courage means stepping up when no one else will, type, "I believe." The rotor blades came to a complete stop. The desert wind swept across the tarmac, carrying dust and the smell of burned fuel. Mia stood beside the damaged Apache, her flight suit dark with sweat, her hands still trembling from adrenaline. The entire base had gone silent. Hundreds of soldiers stood in a wide semicircle around the hangar, watching her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The lieutenant colonel walked toward her slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was hard to read. When he reached her, he stopped 3 feet away and looked her straight in the eye. "Sergeant Torres," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You violated flight regulations. You took an aircraft without proper certification. You disobeyed a direct order to return to base." Mia stood at attention. She did not look away. "Yes, sir." The lieutenant colonel paused. Then his hand snapped up in a sharp salute. "And you saved this entire base." The silence broke. Every soldier erupted into applause and cheers. They rushed forward, surrounding her, slapping her on the back, shaking her hand, lifting her up on their shoulders. She heard her call sign being chanted over and over. Grease 1, Grease 1, Grease 1. Staff Sergeant Kowalski was grinning so wide his face looked like it might split. Even the medics who had been treating wounded soldiers in the corner of the hangar had stopped to clap. Mia felt overwhelmed. She had never been the center of attention like this. She had always been the quiet one, the mechanic in the background, the person nobody noticed. Now everyone was looking at her like she was a hero. She did not feel like a hero. She just felt tired. Within hours, word of what happened spread beyond the base. The incident report was filed and sent up the chain of command. By the next morning, it had reached Central Command. By that afternoon, it was on the desk of a 2-star general at the Pentagon. The general read the report 3 times, then called for a full investigation. He wanted to know how a maintenance sergeant with no official flight hours had managed to fly an Apache helicopter in combat. He wanted to know why she had been allowed to take off in the first place. He wanted to know if this was a breach of protocol or an act of necessity. The investigation took 2 weeks. Military lawyers flew in from Germany to interview everyone on the base. They reviewed the helmet camera footage from Mia's flight. They examined the maintenance logs. They pulled her personnel file and discovered her rejected flight school applications from years ago. They questioned her for 8 hours straight, asking the same questions over and over. Why did you think you could fly? Where did you learn? Did anyone help you? Were you trying to prove something? Mia answered every question honestly. She told them about her father. She told them about the old simulator in the storage building. She told them she had never intended to break the rules. But when the moment came, there was no choice. Someone had to fly, and she was the only one who could. The pilots who reviewed the helmet footage were silent when it finished. One of them, a major with 20 years of flight experience, shook his head slowly. She flew like someone who had been doing it for years, he said. Every maneuver was textbook. The way she handled that tail rotor failure, I'm not sure I could have done it better myself. Another pilot, a captain, leaned back in his chair. She didn't fly with protocol, he said. She flew with her heart. The investigation concluded with a formal hearing. Mia was ordered to report to a conference room where 3 officers sat behind a long table. The senior officer, a colonel with gray hair and a chest full of ribbons, looked at her over his reading glasses. Sergeant Torres, he said, you put this command in a very difficult position. What you did was reckless, unauthorized, and completely outside the boundaries of military regulation. Mia stood at attention. She kept her eyes forward. She expected to be dishonorably discharged. She expected to lose everything. The colonel continued. But what you did also saved the lives of 43 American soldiers who would have died without air support. You acted with courage, skill, and selflessness. He closed the folder in front of him. This board has decided that no disciplinary action will be taken. Mia blinked. She was not sure she had heard correctly. The colonel stood up. Furthermore, Sergeant Torres, you are hereby granted an honorary pilot designation in recognition of your actions under combat conditions. You will not be flight certified through normal channels, but your call sign, Grease 1, will be entered into the official records of this unit. You are dismissed. Mia saluted. Her throat was tight. She could not speak. As she turned to leave, the colonel added one more thing. Torres, your father would have been proud. She stopped. She looked back at him. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to smile. Thank you, sir. If you respect those who act without waiting for permission, comment, respect. 6 months after that day in the desert, Sergeant Amelia Torres stood in front of a classroom at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The room was filled with helicopter mechanics from bases all over the world. They sat in rows, notebooks open, watching her with curiosity and skepticism. She was not a general. She was not a decorated pilot with years of combat experience. She was a mechanic who had flown one mission. But that one mission had changed everything. The lesson she taught that day was not about flying. It was about something deeper. She told them that the military has rules for a reason, and those rules keep people alive. But she also told them that sometimes, in the chaos of war, the rule book does not have an answer. Sometimes the person who saves everyone is not the person anyone expected. Sometimes it is the quiet one in the corner, the one who has been preparing in silence, the one nobody believed in. She told them about her father. She told them about the vision test that disqualified her from flight school. She told them about the old simulator in the storage building and the thousands of hours she had spent teaching herself to fly a machine she thought she would never touch. She told them that preparation is not just about following a checklist. It is about loving something so much that you cannot help but learn everything about it, even if you think you will never get the chance to use it. One of the students raised his hand. He was young, maybe 22, with the same nervous energy Mia had carried when she first enlisted. "Sergeant," he said, "what if we're not good enough? What if we train and we still fail when it matters?" Mia looked at him for a long moment. "Then you fail," she said, "but at least you tried. The only thing worse than failing is never stepping up at all." After the class ended, the training officer pulled her aside. He was a lieutenant colonel named Whitman, the same man who had ordered her to take off that day in Iraq. He had been transferred stateside to run the new emergency flight mechanics program, a course designed to train maintenance crews in basic flight operations in case of catastrophic pilot shortages. Mia was his lead instructor. "You know," Whitman said, "when I gave you that order, I thought I was sending you to your death. I thought I would have to write a letter to your family explaining why I let an untrained mechanic fly a $50 million helicopter into combat." Mia smiled. "I thought the same thing, sir." Whitman shook his head. "But you did not hesitate. You just did what needed to be done." He paused. "That is the rarest kind of courage." On the wall of the training facility, there was a photograph. It showed a woman in a flight suit standing next to an Apache helicopter, her hand resting on the stub wing. Below the photograph was a small glass case containing a silver pilot badge, tarnished and worn. The engraving read, "Captain D. Torres, fly safe." Next to it was a newer badge, shiny and bright, engraved with different words, "SGT Torres, Grease 1." Beneath the display was a brass plaque with a single sentence. "She fixed the bird, then flew it." Every mechanic who passed through Fort Rucker saw that photograph. Some of them stopped to read the story. Some of them did not. But all of them learned the lesson, whether they realized it or not. The lesson was simple. You do not need permission to be ready. You do not need a title to be capable. You just need to care enough to prepare. And when the moment comes, you need to have the courage to step forward. Mia still carried her father's photograph in her pocket. Sometimes late at night when the base was quiet, she would take it out and look at it. She would trace the faded pencil words with her finger. "For Dad, who flew so I could dream." And then she would whisper to the empty air, the way she had done 1,000 times before. "We are flying, Dad. We are finally flying." If you believe silent heroes deserve to be remembered, subscribe to LN Steelheart Stories. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.